Where does your mind actually exist? You think that's an easy question. Of course you do. You'll tap your forehead and say, right here, end of story. But that answer is sloppy, and physics hates sloppy answers. Because the moment you look closely, really closely, the idea that your mind lives inside your skull starts to fall apart. Your brain is a lump of wet, wrinkled matter. It has no colors, no sounds, no memories, no fears, no dreams. And yet somehow, from this gray mush comes the feeling of red, the sound of music, the memory of your childhood, and the terrifying awareness that one day you will die. Now here's the disturbing part. When you measure the brain, you don't find thoughts. You find electrical spikes, voltages, chemical gradients, little particles bouncing around, obeying blind physical laws. Not a single equation contains meaning. Not one neuron knows what it's doing, and yet you know you're here. So where is the mind hiding? Is it inside the neurons? Between them? Is it smeared across the electrical fields like fog? Or is it something far stranger, something that doesn't fully live in the brain at all? Physics has a nasty habit of ruining our comforting stories. And when physicists began asking this question seriously, the answers got uncomfortable. Because every time we tried to point to a location and say, that's where the mind is, the evidence said, no, it isn't. Your thoughts don't sit still. They don't have edges. You can't cut them out. You can't weigh them. And yet they are the most real thing you've ever experienced. So here's the terrifying possibility. What if your mind is not in your head the way your heart is in your chest? What if consciousness is not a place but a process? And what if that process doesn't end where your skull ends? Once you see this problem clearly, you can't unsee it. And the universe starts to feel a lot stranger. Let's begin by clearing away the first lie. It's a lie so familiar that nobody even notices it anymore. The lie is this, that the mind is a thing. We talk about the mind as if it were an object, as if it were something you could point to, store somewhere, or damage the way you damage a liver. We say the mind is inside the brain, like furniture inside a room. And that picture feels so natural that questioning it sounds almost silly. But physics doesn't care how natural a picture feels. Physics only asks whether the picture actually works. So let's slow down and look carefully, because when you do, the whole idea starts wobbling immediately. You can open a skull. Surgeons do it all the time. You can slice the brain into thinner and thinner pieces, stain the tissue, examine it under microscopes, record electrical activity, map neural connections down to ridiculous levels of detail. We've done all of this. We're very good at it. And here's what's strange. No matter how carefully you look, you never find a thought. You find neurons, you find axons, you find synapses firing, ions flowing, voltages changing. You find chemistry and electricity doing exactly what chemistry and electricity always do. But nowhere do you find a memory labeled first love, or a fear labeled death, or an idea labeled I exist. That should bother you. Because if the mind were a thing, we ought to be able to find it the way we find kidneys or tumors. And we don't. Ever. Not even close. Now, people often respond by saying, well, of course you don't find a thought by itself. The mind is an emergent property. That sounds impressive. It's also mostly a way of dodging the problem. Emergent is not an explanation. It's a description of our confusion. It means something happens when many simple things interact, and we don't quite know how to connect the dots. Fair enough. But let's not pretend that saying emergence magically solves anything. Here's the real puzzle, and it's a nasty one. Every physical process we know how to describe can be explained from the outside. You don't need to be an electron to understand what an electron does. You don't need to feel a magnetic field to calculate it. The universe, as physics describes it, doesn't require an inner point of view. And yet consciousness is an inner point of view. That's not a poetic statement. That's a technical disaster, because the one thing you cannot remove from your experience without removing experience itself is the fact that there is something it feels like to be you. Not what you do, not what you say, but what it is like. Physics has no variable for that. And that's where the story starts to get uncomfortable. The brain as a machine, and why that's not enough. Let's be honest. The brain is an extraordinary machine. It's the most complicated physical system we know of. roughly 86 billion neurons, each with thousands of connections, forming a dynamic network that rewires itself constantly. It processes information, predicts outcomes, controls movement, regulates emotion, and keeps you alive without asking permission. No serious person denies this. But here's the crucial question that almost nobody asks carefully enough. If the brain is a machine, where does the experience come from? Machines, as we understand them, don't experience their own operation. A calculator doesn't feel arithmetic. A camera doesn't experience color. A computer doesn't know it's computing. These systems process information perfectly well, but from the inside, there is nothing there. Zero. So why should the brain be different? You can't answer that by just saying, because it's more complex. Complexity alone doesn't magically produce an inner world. You can pile complexity on top of complexity forever and still only get behavior, not experience. This isn't philosophy for philosophers. This is a hard physical problem. If consciousness were just behavior, then anything that behaved like a conscious system would automatically be conscious. But we don't actually believe that. Not really. If a machine says, I am in pain, we still want to know whether it feels pain or whether it's just executing code. That difference matters. And physics has no idea how to draw that line. Which leads us to the first major crack in the story. No place to put the mind. Suppose I ask you a simple question. Where exactly is your mind right now? Not in general. Not kind of. Exactly. Is it in your frontal lobe, your visual cortex, spread evenly across the brain like butter on toast, jumping from neuron to neuron as signals fire? Pick any answer, and I can show you why it fails. If you say it's in a specific region, neuroscience immediately contradicts you. Damage one area, and aspects of consciousness change, but consciousness itself doesn't vanish. Memory can go, language can go, vision can go. But awareness stubbornly remains as long as the system is alive. If you say it's distributed, that doesn't help either. Distributed what? Electricity, chemistry, patterns? None of those things have an inner point of view by themselves. And here's the kicker. Even if you map the entire brain state perfectly, every neuron, every synapse, every molecule, you would still only have a description from the outside. You would know what the system is doing, but not what it is like. That's not a small gap, that's a canyon. And it forces us to confront a deeply disturbing possibility. The mind may not be something that exists in space the way physical objects do, which is a ridiculous thing to say until you realize that physics itself already contains things that don't sit neatly in space. The observer problem sneaks in. Now, physicists get nervous when consciousness enters the conversation, and for good reason. It tends to attract sloppy thinking, mysticism, hand-waving, nonsense dressed up as profundity. But here's the problem. Consciousness refuses to stay out of physics. In classical physics, the observer doesn't matter. You can measure a system without fundamentally changing what it is. The universe just does its thing. But in quantum mechanics, whether we like it or not, the observer is part of the story. Measurement changes outcomes. Probabilities collapse into actual events. And suddenly, the act of observation isn't passive anymore. Now, don't misunderstand me. This does not mean the human mind magically creates reality. That's a cartoon version of the problem, and it's wrong. But it does mean that physics, at its deepest level, has trouble describing the world without referencing interactions that look suspiciously like information, observation, and knowledge. And that should ring alarm bells. Because if the fundamental laws of nature already struggle to define what counts as an observer, then maybe the mind isn't a late add-on to the universe. Maybe it's tangled up with the way reality works from the start. That idea is dangerous. It threatens the neat separation we like between objective world and subjective experience. And physicists hate that. But ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. You are not inside your head, at least not the way you think. Here's a thought experiment. When you look at a tree, where is the experience of the tree happening? You'll say, in my brain. Fine, but the tree you experience is not made of neurons. It's green, tall, textured. None of those properties exist in your brain tissue. So the experience of the tree is not located where the tree is, and it's not located as a tree inside your skull either. What exists physically is a chain of interactions. Photons hit your retina, signals propagate through neural circuits, patterns form, all measurable, all objective. But the experience, the thing you actually live inside, is not identical to any single step in that chain. So where is it? The honest answer is, we don't know. And worse, we don't even know what kind of question that is. Because location is a spatial concept, and experience may not be spatial in the way physical objects are. Asking where the mind is may be like asking where a melody is. You can point to the instruments. You can analyze the sound waves. But the melody itself is not sitting anywhere in space. That analogy helps, but it also hides a trap. A melody doesn't experience itself. You do. And that brings us back to the one thing we cannot eliminate, the fact that experience exists at all. Why this is not just philosophy. At this point, people like to wave their hands and say, this is all philosophy. Neuroscience will solve it eventually. That's a comforting belief. It's also unjustified. Neuroscience is phenomenal at correlating brain states with mental states, but correlation is not identity. Knowing that activity in region X corresponds to experience Y does not tell you why experience exists in the first place. You can build a perfect map and still miss the territory. And here's the crucial point. If consciousness were just another physical process, it should be describable entirely from the outside, but it isn't. The subjective aspect refuses to disappear, no matter how complete the objective description becomes. That's not a gap in data. It's a gap in kind, which means something is deeply wrong with our starting assumptions, the shocking realization, and the door it opens. So let's say the quiet part out loud. The mind may not be a thing. It may not have a location. It may not be reducible to parts. And it may not be fully describable from the outside at all. That doesn't mean it's supernatural. It doesn't mean it violates physics. It means our picture of physics might be incomplete in a very specific way, and that's not unprecedented. Physics has been wrong before. Not a little wrong, fundamentally wrong. Space and time turned out not to be what we thought. Matter turned out not to be solid. Causality turned out to be probabilistic. So why should consciousness be the one thing that neatly fits into our old categories? Maybe the mind is not something that exists inside the universe, like a chair or a star. Maybe it exists as a way the universe experiences itself. That idea sounds poetic. It's also terrifying, because it erases the boundary between observer and observed. And if that boundary dissolves, then the question, where does your mind exist, stops having a simple answer, which is exactly where things start to get interesting. Let's make things worse. Up to now, we've only questioned where the mind exists. That alone is enough to give people headaches. But the next step is far more disturbing, because now we have to ask what exactly exists. You probably believe there is a you inside your head, not metaphorically, literally, a center, a core, a little commander sitting behind your eyes, watching the world, making decisions, steering the body like a vehicle. That belief feels so obvious that denying it sounds insane. But once again, physics and neuroscience have a habit of turning obvious ideas into rubble. So let's look carefully. No poetry, no mysticism, just honesty. The strange absence at the center. If there really were a central self, we should be able to find it the way we find other controlling systems. In machines, there's a control unit. In organizations, there's leadership. In the body, there are regulatory centers. So where is the self? Neuroscientists have looked hard for decades. They've recorded neurons firing during decisions. They've tracked brain activity during emotion, memory, attention, fear, love, pain. They've isolated networks involved in planning, impulse control, self-reflection. And what they found is awkward. There is no single place where you live, no command center, no master neuron, no privileged spot where consciousness gathers to look out at the world. Instead, what we see is something messier and far more unsettling. We see parallel processes, competing systems, modules that activate, suppress, override, cooperate, and contradict one another constantly. Decisions emerge from conflict, not command. Perception is assembled, not received. Memory is reconstructed, not retrieved. The brain is not ruled, it negotiates. And that alone should make you suspicious of the idea of a unified self. Split brains and broken illusions. Now let's talk about patients with split brains. When the corpus callosum, the bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, is severed, something extraordinary happens. You don't get half a person. You get two semi-independent systems sharing one body. One hand can button a shirt while the other unbuttons it. One side can answer questions verbally while the other responds through actions. One hemisphere can know something the other does not. So which one is you? If the self were a single entity, this shouldn't be possible, but it happens regularly, and it's not limited to extreme surgery. Even in healthy brains, we see something similar, just less dramatic. Multiple systems generating intentions, perceptions, and interpretations simultaneously, with no single system in charge. The sense of unity comes later, after the fact. That's important, so let's say it clearly. The feeling of being one self is not evidence of a central self. It is the result of integration, not the cause. The brain decides before you do. Here's another uncomfortable experiment. In lab studies, researchers measure brain activity before a person makes a decision like pressing a button, and what they find is consistent and disturbing. The brain starts preparing the action before the person becomes consciously aware of deciding. Milliseconds, sometimes seconds. The conscious decision comes last. Now, people love to argue about what this means. Free will, determinism, all that philosophical mess. But we don't need to solve free will to see the problem here. If you are the conscious self, then you are not initiating actions. You're being informed about them after the process is already underway. Which means the self you identify with the narrator in your head is not running the show. It's reporting on it, and that changes everything. The narrator trick, think about your inner voice. The stream of thoughts you hear in your head. That voice feels like you. It comments, explains, justifies, plans, judges. But here's the trick. That voice is not in charge. It's a storyteller. It takes what has already happened, emotions triggered, actions initiated, impulses generated, and constructs a coherent story that makes it all feel intentional and unified. This is not speculation. This is how the brain works. The left hemisphere, in particular, is very good at inventing explanations. Even when it has no access to the real cause of an action, it will confidently explain something, anything. Accuracy is optional. Coherence is not. And because the explanation feels smooth, we mistake it for control. We confuse narration with authorship. That confusion is the backbone of the self. Why the self feels so real. Now here's the truly sneaky part. Even if the self is a construction, even if it's a story layered on top of processes, it still feels real, intensely real. Pain feels personal. Fear feels personal. Love feels personal. Loss feels personal. So how can something that doesn't fundamentally exist feel so undeniable? Because reality does not require substance. It requires consistency. A rainbow feels real, but it's not an object. It's an interaction between light, water droplets, and perspective. Move your head, and the rainbow moves with you. No fixed location, no material body, but still real. The self is similar. It is a pattern that persists over time. A stable loop of perception, memory, prediction, and feedback. As long as the loop holds, the experience holds. Break the loop and the self dissolves, which is exactly what we see in certain neurological and psychological conditions. When the self fractures, in depersonalization disorders, people report something terrifying. They feel present, but not themselves. The world feels distant. Their thoughts feel alien. The sense of ownership over experience weakens. They are conscious, but the self is gone. In advanced meditation states, similar reports emerge. Awareness without identity, experience without a center, seeing without a seer. And under anesthesia, deep sleep or coma, the integration collapses entirely. Experience disappears, not because the brain stops working completely, but because the necessary coordination breaks down. So consciousness is not a switch, it's a structure. And the self is a specific mode of that structure, not the foundation. The dangerous conclusion. Let's pause and summarize the damage so far. There is no central self in the brain. Decisions are initiated before conscious awareness. The feeling of unity is constructed, not fundamental. The narrator is not the author. The self can weaken, fragment, or vanish while awareness remains. If all of that is true, and the evidence says it is, then the self is not what we thought it was. It is not a thing. It is not a controller. It is not a location. It is a process. And that brings us back to our original question in a new, more dangerous form. If the self is a process, not an object, if consciousness is a pattern, not a place, then asking where the mind exists may be the wrong question entirely. The self as a boundary illusion. Here's a thought that should unsettle you. You feel like there is a clear boundary between you and the world, inside and outside, subject and object. But that boundary is not physically sharp. Your sensory systems are in constant exchange with the environment. Photons, vibrations, chemicals, all crossing the so-called boundary every moment. Your body is not sealed. It is porous, dynamic. And your brain does not passively receive information. It predicts, filters, constructs, corrects. What you experience as the world is partly generated by you. What you experience as you is partly shaped by the world. The boundary is functional, not fundamental, which means the self is not a thing separated from reality. It is a relationship within reality. Why this terrifies people? People don't resist this idea because it's complicated. They resist it because it's threatening. If there is no central self, then who is in control? Who is responsible? Who survives? Who dies? The fear is not intellectual. It's existential. Because if the self is not fundamental, then identity is fragile, temporary, conditional, and that sounds like annihilation. But physics doesn't care what scares us. A quiet shift in perspective. Here's the subtle but crucial shift. Losing the idea of a solid self does not mean nothing exists. It means what exists is different from what we assumed. Instead of a thing, there is a pattern. Instead of a controller, there is coordination. Instead of a location, there is a process unfolding in time. And processes don't need a center to be real. A hurricane has no core object called the hurricane. Remove the wind, pressure gradients, and temperature differences, and the hurricane vanishes. But while the pattern holds, the hurricane is undeniably real. The self may be exactly like that, which leads us to a far more disturbing possibility than the self doesn't exist. The self exists, but only as long as the process runs. No more, no less. Where this leaves the mind. So now the question shifts again. If the mind is not located, if the self is not a thing, if consciousness is a process, then what is the mind actually doing? And more importantly, what is it doing that physics cannot yet explain? Because the existence of experience itself still refuses to disappear. And that means the hardest problem is still waiting for us. Up to now, we've been dismantling comfortable assumptions, slowly, methodically. First, the mind wasn't a thing. Then the self wasn't a controller. Now we arrive at the idea that many scientists cling to like a life raft. Consciousness is information processing. It sounds clean, modern, scientific, and it's probably wrong. Let's find out why. The seductive power of information. Information is a marvelous concept. It lets us unify communication, computation, genetics, and physics under one umbrella. Bits, signals, codes, patterns. Brains process information. Computers process information. Therefore, so the argument goes, consciousness is just information processed in the right way. Elegant, isn't it? Too elegant, because there's a fatal flaw hiding in plain sight. Information has no inner life. Information, by itself, does not feel like anything. A book contains information. It does not know it. A hard drive contains information. It does not experience it. A weather map contains information. It does not feel stormy. Information is always about something. Experience is always something itself. That difference matters. You can describe information entirely from the outside. There is no missing piece, no subjective remainder. But consciousness is the subjective remainder. And that means information alone cannot be the whole story. The Chinese room problem, without philosophy nonsense. Let's strip this down to its bones. Imagine a system that perfectly manipulates symbols. Inputs come in, outputs go out. The rules are flawless. The behavior is indistinguishable from understanding. But inside, nothing understands. This isn't mystical, it's mechanical. You can follow rules without knowing what they mean. A computer does this constantly. It processes syntax, not semantics, structure, not experience. So even if a brain or a machine processes information perfectly, that does not guarantee there is something it is like to be that system. Behavior is not experience. Simulation is not duplication. And this is where the information story quietly collapses. Computation isn't consciousness. Now, people often say, but the brain is not just any computer. It's a biological computer. Fine. But biology doesn't fix the problem. Replace silicon with neurons. Replace electrons with ions. Replace code with chemistry. You still have processing without intrinsic experience unless you sneak consciousness in by assumption. And that's cheating. If you say this kind of processing produces experience, you must explain why, not just point to complexity and hope nobody asks, because complexity has no inner glow. The map is not the territory. Again, let's imagine we build a perfect simulation of a brain. Every neuron modeled, every synapse accurate, every signal reproduced. From the outside, it behaves exactly like a conscious person. Now comes the uncomfortable question. Is there anyone home? There is no experiment that can answer that conclusively. None. Not now. Possibly not ever. Which means consciousness is not something you can detect purely from behavior or structure. That alone should terrify any theory that tries to reduce it to information. Why physics is suddenly nervous? Physics loves things that can be measured from the outside. Fields, forces, energies, probabilities. Consciousness refuses that treatment. You can correlate it, you can influence it, you can disrupt it, but you cannot extract it, weigh it, or point to it in space. And yet here it is. That makes consciousness an anomaly, a hole in the explanatory fabric. And physics hates holes. The hard problem is not a joke. Some people dismiss the so-called hard problem of consciousness as wordplay, a distraction. That's nonsense. The hard problem is simply this. Why is any physical process accompanied by experience at all? Not intelligence, not behavior, not reporting, experience. Why is there something it is like? If your theory cannot answer that, even in principle, it is incomplete. And information-based theories can't answer it. They describe function. They never reach feeling. A dangerous possibility appears. Here's where things start to get genuinely unsettling. If consciousness cannot be reduced to information, if it cannot be reduced to computation, if it cannot be located in space like an object, then maybe consciousness is not something that emerges from physics. Maybe it is something physics has been quietly assuming away. That's a dangerous thought. It threatens the idea that physics is complete without reference to experience. And yet history suggests this wouldn't be the first time physics had to expand its categories. A reminder from the past. There was a time when physicists believed space and time were separate. That matter was solid. That determinism ruled absolutely. Those ideas felt obvious until they didn't. Relativity rewired space and time. Quantum mechanics shattered classical certainty. Fields replaced particles as fundamental entities. Each time, the universe turned out stranger than our intuitions allowed. So why should consciousness be the one thing that fits neatly into our old framework? The observer refuses to leave. No matter how hard physicists try to remove the observer from the equations, the observer keeps sneaking back in. Measurement, information, knowledge, outcomes. Something about reality seems to require a point of view, not just mathematically, but existentially. And that's a problem. if your theory assumes only third-person descriptions exist. The cracks are widening. Let's take stock. Information explains structure, not experience. Computation explains function, not feeling. Complexity explains behavior, not awareness. Physics explains interactions, not presence. And yet presence exists, not metaphorically, literally, right now. So either consciousness is an illusion which collapses under inspection, or our theories are missing something fundamental. There is no third option. The uncomfortable hint. Here's a hint physicists don't like to say out loud. Consciousness may not be produced by the universe in the way heat is produced by motion. It may be a basic feature of reality, like space, time, or energy. Not mystical, not magical, just fundamental. That idea has consequences, and most people recoil from them immediately because it raises questions nobody is ready to answer. If consciousness is fundamental, then it is not owned by brains. Brains organize it, channel it, localize it, but do not create it from nothing. Just as radios do not create radio waves, they tune them. That analogy is dangerous, but it's instructive. It suggests that the mind is not a thing inside the head, but an interaction between physical processes and something deeper. And that something deeper has been hiding in plain sight, the fact that experience exists at all. Why this changes the question completely. So now, once again, the question mutates. We no longer ask, where does the mind exist? We ask, what role does the mind play in reality itself? And once you ask that, you are no longer doing neuroscience. You are doing physics at the edge of what physics can currently say. A quiet warning. At this stage, many people want to stop. They retreat to safer ground. They say, this is speculation. But every major advance in physics began as speculation guided by stubborn facts that refuse to go away. And consciousness is the most stubborn fact of all. You can doubt everything else. You cannot doubt experience, because doubt itself is an experience. That makes consciousness uniquely unavoidable. Where this leaves us, information is not enough. Computation is not enough. Structure is not enough. Something is missing. And whatever it is, it sits right at the intersection of mind and reality. Up to this point, we've done something dangerous. We've taken consciousness seriously, not poetically, not spiritually, seriously as a fact that demands explanation on the same level as mass, charge, space, and time. And once you do that, something unsettling happens. You start to notice that the universe has been quietly structured as if experience matters, not emotionally, structurally. Let me explain. Physics pretends consciousness isn't there. Modern physics is built on a clever trick. It describes the universe entirely from the outside. Particles don't feel, fields don't notice, equations don't care. The universe in this picture is a vast machine grinding forward blindly, and consciousness is treated as an accidental side effect, something that appears late, briefly, and insignificantly. That story works beautifully until you remember one problem. Physics itself is known only through experience. Every measurement, every observation, every equation written on a board, all of it exists inside consciousness, which means physics depends on the very thing it refuses to explain. That's not a philosophical nitpick. That's a logical loop. The observer is not optional. Physicists love to say the universe doesn't need observers. That sounds bold. It's also careless, because an observer is not just a human with eyeballs. An observer is anything that distinguishes one outcome from another. Measurement is not passive. It is an interaction that selects. In quantum mechanics, this is not a metaphor. It's built into the mathematics. Before measurement, a system exists as possibilities. After measurement, it exists as an outcome. Something draws that line. Call it interaction, call it decoherence, call it collapse. The name doesn't matter. The fact remains. Reality behaves differently when outcomes are registered. And registered is an informational and possibly experiential word. Why this makes physicists uncomfortable? Because if experience plays any fundamental role, even indirectly, then the universe is not purely objective in the way we imagined. It doesn't mean minds create reality. It doesn't mean consciousness is magical. It means experience may be a basic aspect of how reality is structured. And that is terrifying to a discipline built on removing subjectivity, a radical but simple idea. Here is the idea most physicists circle around but rarely say plainly. Consciousness may be as fundamental as space-time, not produced by the universe, not floating outside the universe, but woven into it. Not thoughts, not personalities, not memories, just raw experience. The simplest possible ingredient. There is something it is like for reality to happen. This is not panpsychism, at least not the silly version. People hear this idea and immediately panic. Rocks are conscious? Electrons have feelings? The universe is thinking thoughts? No. Stop. That's anthropomorphism, a failure of imagination. Fundamental consciousness does not mean complex minds everywhere. It means the capacity for experience exists at the most basic level, just as mass or charge exists at the most basic level. Complex minds arise when physical systems organize that capacity in specific ways. Brains don't create consciousness from nothing. They shape it. Why this solves a problem nothing else can. Remember the hard problem. Why is there experience at all? If consciousness is fundamental, that question dissolves. You don't ask why mass exists. You don't ask why space exists. They exist because they are part of the universe's basic structure. Experience may be the same. The mystery shifts from why does experience exist to why does experience organize itself this way? And that is a scientific question. The brain as an organizer, not a generator. Now let's reframe the brain with this idea in mind. Instead of thinking, the brain produces consciousness, we think the brain constrains and structures consciousness, just as a prism structures light, a lens focuses waves, a radio tunes signals. The brain does not summon experience out of nothing. It shapes what kind of experience is possible. Damage the brain, and experience changes not because consciousness disappears, but because the structure that organizes it breaks down. This explains why consciousness fades gradually, fragments, or alters rather than simply switching off like a light. Why death becomes a different question. At this point, people usually interrupt. So, are you saying consciousness survives death? No. I'm saying the question itself has been malformed. If consciousness is fundamental but minds are patterns, then the pattern can end without consciousness itself vanishing. Just as a whirlpool ends without water disappearing. The self dissolves. The process stops. The organization collapses. But the underlying capacity for experience is not annihilated because it was never owned by the self in the first place. This is not comforting. It's not horrifying, avoiding logic. It's neutral, which is why people hate it. Why this isn't religion. Religion gives answers. This gives constraints. Religion says, here is what must be true. Physics says, here is what cannot be ignored. Consciousness exists. That is not optional. Any theory of reality that cannot accommodate that fact is incomplete, no matter how successful it is elsewhere. This idea doesn't tell you who you are. It tells you what kind of universe you are in, and that universe is stranger than a lifeless machine. The universe is not blind. Here's the quiet implication that unsettles people the most. The universe may not be blind to itself, not in the sense of awareness as humans know it, but in the sense that experience is not alien to reality. Reality doesn't just happen. It is happening, and that difference matters. Why this keeps coming back? Every few decades, physics tries to bury consciousness, and every few decades, it resurfaces because it refuses to stay out of the equations. Information, observation, measurement, entropy, knowledge. The language keeps drifting back toward experience. Not because physicists are sloppy, but because reality keeps forcing the issue. A subtle shift in meaning. If consciousness is fundamental, then you are not an accident in a dead universe. You are a localized expression of something universal. Experience is not rare, it is organized. That does not make you special. It makes you temporary. And strangely, that's more honest than the old story, the final turn before the edge. So now we arrive at the sharpest question yet. Not, where does your mind exist? Not, what is the self? But, what does it mean for the universe to experience itself as you? Because if consciousness is fundamental, then you are not separate from reality. You are a way reality is happening right now. And that idea, once understood, changes how everything looks. Now we're far enough in that there's no reason to pretend anymore. If you followed everything so far, really followed it, then one quiet realization should already be pressing against your thoughts. The way you normally think about yourself is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not metaphorically wrong. Structurally wrong. And the final mistake is the most personal one of all. The final illusion, I am in here. You feel like you are inside your head, looking out, watching the world go by, piloting a body like a vehicle. This feeling is so strong that questioning it feels absurd, almost insulting. But that doesn't make it true. Let's examine it carefully. If you are inside your head, then there must be an inside location, an outside world, and a boundary separating the two. But we already saw that the boundary is fuzzy, functional, and constructed. And we saw that there is no central observer location in the brain. So where exactly are you supposed to be? You can't find yourself in the neurons. You can't find yourself between them. You can't find yourself watching the brain do its work. Because the moment you look for the observer, you find only more processes. And that's the crack that breaks the whole picture. There is experience, but no owner. Here's the sentence people resist the hardest. Experience is happening, but there is no separate experiencer behind it. That doesn't mean experience is fake. It doesn't mean you don't exist. It means the structure is different from what intuition suggests. Rain falls without a rainer. Music plays without a musicer. And experience occurs without a central owner. The idea of an owner is something the brain constructs because it's useful, because it helps coordinate memory, prediction, and action. But usefulness is not the same as truth. Why the illusion is so convincing? If this illusion were weak, nobody would fall for it. But it's not weak. It's airtight because it's reinforced constantly. Memory stitches experiences together into a narrative. Language pins that narrative to a name. Social interaction reflects that name back at you. Biology rewards consistency with survival. The result is a stable loop. I remember being me, therefore I am me. But memory is not a mirror, it's a reconstruction. Every time you recall yourself, you are rebuilding the pattern, not discovering a permanent object. The self feels continuous because the process is continuous. That's all. The shock nobody expects. Here's the moment most people don't anticipate. Losing the idea of a central self does not feel like disappearing. It feels like relief. Because the constant tension, the sense of being trapped behind your eyes, responsible for controlling everything, loosens. Experience continues. Thoughts continue. Decisions continue. But the feeling of a little commander struggling to keep it all together fades. And nothing collapses. That's the shocking part. Why fear lives where the self used to be. Most fear is fear for the self. Fear of loss. Fear of failure. Fear of death. Fear of not being enough. When the self is seen as a fragile object that must be defended, every change becomes a threat. But if the self is a process, temporary, dynamic, pattern-based, then fear loses its grip. Not because nothing matters, but because there is no permanent object to protect. Pain still hurts. Loss still hurts. But the existential panic softens because nothing essential was ever at risk. What death looks like from here. Now we can finally talk about death without mythology. Death is not the destruction of a thing. It is the ending of a pattern. The body stops maintaining the organization. The brain stops coordinating experience. The loop dissolves. And that's it. No observer watches this happen. No self experiences its own absence. The fear of being dead is a category error, because experience does not persist to witness its own non-existence. Just as sleep has no memory of unconsciousness, the pattern ends. The universe continues, quietly. Why this is not nihilism? People hear this and say, so nothing matters? That reaction misunderstands what mattering means. Meaning does not require permanence. Music doesn't need to last forever to be meaningful. A sunset doesn't need to repeat to matter. Meaning arises because things are temporary, not despite it. If you were eternal, nothing would matter. There would be no urgency, no texture, no stakes. Finite patterns are what make meaning possible. You are not separate from reality. Here is the deepest shift of all. You are not a subject inside an objective universe. You are an event within reality, a localized, temporary way the universe is experiencing itself right now. Not special, not privileged, not permanent, but real as a wave in the ocean, as real as a flame in a fire. The wave is not separate from the water. The flame is not separate from combustion, and you are not separate from the universe. Why the question finally dissolves. So let's return to the original question. Where does your mind actually exist? And now we can answer it honestly. Your mind does not exist in your head. Your head exists within the processes that shape experience. The mind is not a location, not a container, not a thing. It is the activity of reality taking a particular form. Asking where it is makes no more sense than asking where a dance is located. The dance is not in the room. The room is part of the dance. What changes when you see this? You still plan. You still choose. You still care. But you stop clinging to the idea that there is a fragile me at the center of it all. Life becomes less about defending an identity and more about participating in a process. Less about control, more about clarity. The disturbing calm at the end. Once the illusion of the self loosens, something unexpected happens. The world doesn't become cold. It becomes immediate. Colors sharpen. Sounds deepen. Moments feel fuller. Not because something new was added, but because something false was removed. The mind was never inside you. You were inside the mind, and the mind was never separate from the universe. The last sentence. Physics didn't discover this by accident. It backed into it by refusing to ignore what experience actually is. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. There is experience. There is no owner. There is a universe happening right now. As you